Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
My name is Kirsten Wiley. I'm here today to introduce and welcome Daniel Kahneman, who is visiting us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Thinking Fast and Slow is a tour of the mind and explains the two systems that drive the way we think. System 1 is fast and intuitive and emotional. System 2 is slower, more deliberate, and more logical. How do we know where we can and cannot trust our intuitions and what it means to tap into slow thinking? Here today to tell us is Daniel Kahneman. Daniel received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his work that challenged the rational model of judgment and decision-making. He is a professor emeritus of psychology and public affairs at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School and a founding partner of The Greatest Good, a business and philanthropy consulting company. Please join me in welcoming him to Microsoft. Thank you.
Well, it's true, actually, that I've written a book about two systems. I don't believe, though, in the existence of these systems. So let me begin by explaining that I think that they're fictions. And let me explain why I chose this fiction. I speak of System 1, which is quick and intuitive, and I speak of System 2, which is sort of more deliberate and effortful. But there are no systems in the sense that we understand systems. The reason I chose this terminology, and I'm being taken to task by my colleagues for it, you're really not supposed to invoke little men inside the head, to explain behavior, and which is what I sound as if I were doing. The reason is very similar it's related to a very good book that appeared this year. It's called Moonwalking with Einstein. And it describes the adventures of Joshua Furr, who was a science writer, and he saw the memory championship of the United States, and he became curious about how that is done. And a year later, he was the memory champion of the United States. Very entertaining book, very good. And the point of that book is that people are very bad at some things and very good at other things, and they're terrible at learning lists. And they're very good at learning routes. And so if you want to remember a list, then you have to perform a mental exercise of distributing the items in the list along a mental route, and then you will remember the list. And this is how all those tremendous feats of memory are performed. The Greeks discovered that system, and it's being slightly improved to this day. Very much the same thing happens when we want to talk about psychology and about mental processes. So there is one way of telling you that some processes are automatic and effortless. So, that is true of perception, and it's true of some emotional reactions, and you will see it's true of many things, that they're automatic and effortless. And there are other activities of the mind that are effortful, and you can talk about those. And they have the character of lists. But there is something else that the mind does really very, very well indeed. The mind is excellent at dealing with active agents. It seems to be specialized for it. And we are very, very good at assigning traits to agents, just in the same way that we're good at remembering routes. We assign traits, we assign behavior. We have a mind that is specialized for understanding agents. I'm just taking a ride on this. So instead of speaking of effortful operations and effortless operations, I call them the operation that System 1 performs and the operation that System 2 performs. I find that it helps me think, and I think it is very helpful to other people. Don't be misled. I don't think there are systems, but it's a very good shortcut to learn about two kinds of operations. So let me tell you a bit. Whoops. Let me tell you a bit about those two operations by bringing some examples. So this is one way that thoughts come to mind. System 1 produces that. And what's important about this is that this is not something you do. The judgment that she's angry is something that happens to you. Subjectively, you're passive. And that is true of many mental products, that they seem to occur passively, so far as we're concerned. We're not the author of them. They happen to us. And there's a long history of dealing with thoughts that comes from this. Then there is another kind of thinking, and so you didn't produce that number. I mean, unless a few of you might have done, but you shouldn't have. But to produce that number, you have to do something else entirely. You have to go through a sequence of operations, and this is something that you feel you're doing. You are the author of this action, and so subjectively, there is a really fairly straightforward demarcation between things that happen to us, mental products that happen to us, and mental products that we produce, and where we have the sense that we're doing it. Whether free will and the sense of agency is an illusion or not is another psychological problem, and that I won't go into, but the sense of agency is clearly present. Then there is something else that System 2 does. And what I mean by that is there is something else that demands effort. And when we know that something demands effort, it's because it can be interfered with. So something demands effort if it's hard to do while you're making a left turn into traffic, because that takes a lot of your capacity and there is less left. And so 17 times 24 is going to be very hard to do while you're making a left turn into traffic. And there are other operations that have the same character, that is, that they're susceptible to interference. And one of these is actually self-monitoring. And I'll give you an example with a riddle that you may be familiar with. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And the point is that everyone has an intuition when those three lines appear on the text. And the intuition is 10 cents. I mean, 10 cents is the first association. It's wrong. But it's 5 cents. But for most of you, if not all of you, I've seen one person shaking his head, for most of you, 10 cents came to mind. And then you may or may not have checked. Probably in this audience you did check. When Princeton and Harvard students are given this problem, 50% of them write 10 cents. And it gets to 85% in some universities that remain nameless. Those are the better ones. What that means, somebody who writes 10 cents hasn't checked. And this leads to a very important characteristic of System 2. System 2 is lazy. Now, that is really a naughty thing to say in well-informed psychological circles, but it's very easy to keep that in mind. It is a system that operates on the law of least effort. It is easily depleted. It is easily distracted. And when it is depleted or distracted, performance deteriorates, including self-monitoring. And when people are keeping things in mind, they tend to get quite poor at self-monitoring, and they do impulsive things. An example of an experiment of that kind is you give people 7 digits to keep in mind, to remember, and then you give them other tasks. And you see which tasks are impaired when you're holding 7 digits in your head. And people use more sexist language when they're holding 7 digits in their head. When you give them a choice between chocolate cake and fruit salad, they're more likely to choose the chocolate cake if they're holding 7 digits in their head. So there is a function of control, which is the System 2 function, and that function can be impaired by and disrupted when you make the system busy, cognitively busy, or depleted. So, let me go fairly quickly in introducing you to the way that System 1, as I understand it, works. And, okay. Now, let me tell you of a few things that happened to you while you stared at those two words. So, one thing that happened to you is, of course, you read those words. You didn't have to intend to. That just happened to you. The reading is automatic. It's a System 1 operation. Then memories came to mind. Most of them unpleasant, of course. And you had very little control over that. That is your associative memory. Your memory delivered things to you passively. It did more than that. You recoiled very slightly, but measurably. When people are exposed to a noxious word, they draw back. There were physiological changes. An increase in heart rate, slight increase in blood pressure, changes that are associated with threat. So your system reacted as if this was a real threat. One of the more important things, and that really labels all of this as a function of associative memory, is that there are a whole lot of words that you would now find easier to recognize. So if those words were whispered, the threshold at which you could detect them or recognize them is now lower than it was before. And they would be words like stink and smell and nausea and illness, and actually a very large set of words. The word vomit in this case evokes or activates a whole network of associations, and those associations do not come explicitly to mind, but they will facilitate recognition if there is another stimulus. So you are prepared for a lot of things. So clearly, one of the functions of System 1 is preparation. Now, while you were watching this, a lot of the changes that occur are actually reciprocal. So you make a disgust face, which most people do. When people make a disgust face, they're more likely to experience disgust. But as we know, for example, that when you stick a pencil in people's mouth like this, which forces their face into the shape of a smile, they find cartoons funnier. If you stick the pencil like that, which makes them frown, they find cartoons less funny. So the shape of your face influences the emotions you have. Recoiling induces negative emotion. Negative emotions induces recoiling. What you get is a mutually reinforcing network of activation, or activation within a network, which creates a coherent pattern. I'll call that associative coherence, and that is one of the main ways that System 1 functions. It produces associatively coherent responses to stimuli. Now, we know a great deal, actually, about the way that this system works, this responses to stimuli. Let me give you an example, and I'll come back to the bananas in a minute. You read the first of these two things as ABC, the second one as 12, 13, 14. But in fact, the B and the 13 are identical. They are the same stimulus. What this shows is that the interpreter system, System 1, is context sensitive. It interprets. Everything is brought to bear at the same time in creating a coherent interpretation. And that is a key function of associative memory, this production of coherence. It produces a story, it produces an interpretation. Now, the system is also oriented to causality, and I'll have several opportunities to emphasize that because I think it's very important. So there were two words there, bananas and vomit. There was absolutely no reason for you to make a story out of those two words, but you did. The interpretation of that is that the bananas, somehow you were looking for a cause of the vomit, and the bananas looked like a possible cause. And so temporarily you're off bananas. Now, this is temporary, it will pass, but there is an interpretation, a causal interpretation. You were not asked to do it, it happens automatically. This orientation to causality and to coherent stories is another essential characteristic of that system that I call fast thinking. Now, this associative memory, the network, is pre-existing. The connections between the nodes, between the elements of that network, the ideas, if you will, are pre-existing, and they contain a huge amount of world knowledge that gets activated at a tremendous speed. And, to give you my favorite study of that, it's a study in which an upper-class male British voice says the word, "I have large tattoos all down my back." And I will not try to do that with an upper-class English voice. I couldn't. But what happens is approximately 3/10 of a second after that word, the brain reacts with a characteristic response of surprise. People who speak in upper-class English voices do not, in our world image, have large tattoos down their back. That gets registered immediately. The speed, the subtlety of the amount of work that would need to be done to produce that recognition, that this is a British voice, it is upper class related to tattoos, all sorts of things. All that happens at enormous speed. All of this is fast thinking. So it's highly sophisticated, and there is more to it. I mean, this is a system one, which operates at different levels of fluency. So sometimes it is able to make a coherent story of the information, sometimes it is not. And its own fluency is an input for other operations. So it monitors its own fluency of processing. I won't go into that. Now, let me emphasize a little more. Let me go back to this issue of causality. Let me give you an example. Which is more probable? That a mother has blue eyes if her daughter has blue eyes, or that a daughter has blue eyes if her mother has blue eyes. Now, here again, there is an intuitive interpretation, and most people, if you force them to respond very quickly, see one of these sentences as much more normal than the other. And this is that a daughter has blue eyes if her mother has blue eyes. That's the flow of causality. In fact, the probabilities are equal if the proportion of blue eyes, if the frequency of blue eyes are the same in the two generations, the probabilities are precisely equal. The intuition is quite powerful, and people who do not know statistics and do not bother to check and to compute massively prefer one of these statements to the other. Here is another example, and I do want to emphasize this causality, because system one is very good with causes and very, very poor with statistics. This is one of the characteristics of system one. It deals with individuals. It deals with agents. It deals with storylines. It does not deal very well with ensembles and with statistical facts. And one of the things that it doesn't do well at all is combine statistical information with case-specific information. Let me give you an example of that. There are two cab companies in a city. 85% of the cabs are blue, 15% of the cabs are green. And there was a hit-and-run accident, and there was a witness. And the witness said with 80% probability, subjective probability, that the cab that was involved in the accident was a green cab. And or the witness just said it was a blue cab, a green cab, and then the court tested and found out that this is the probability. There's a probability of 80% that the witness is telling the truth. What is your probability that the cab that was involved in the accident was blue? Now, you probably know the answer. Most people don't. most people just say 80%. They completely neglect the base rate information. In fact, this is a straight Bayesian inference problem. The correct answer is, 41%. But people do not combine. And there are many other instances. You give them the base rate, you give them the statistical information, then you give them case information, case-specific information. They don't use the base rate. The base rate is supplanted. And this really happens a great deal. Now, let me give you an example. Very similar example, formally, I think, identical, but which produces quite a different reaction. Okay. There are two cab companies in the city. Half of the cabs are green, half of the cabs are blue. But 85% of the accidents are caused by the green company. And now there was a witness and the story is the same. What's the difference? The difference is that this information leads immediately to a causal interpretation. This is not a statistical fact. What you have immediately inferred from this is that the drivers in the green company are reckless fools. I mean, this is why they cause 85% of the accidents. There must be, you have inferred a cause. And that cause, that causal information applies to every green cab. And now, that and the witness are both case information about the same case, about the same story, and people get it right. So you have two versions of a Bayesian inference problem. People do miserably in one, and they do quite well in the other. And the difference is whether the information lends itself to a causal interpretation about the case at hand. And if it does, it will be used, and it will be intuitive. And if it doesn't, in general, for most people, it will be ignored. Okay. Let me go back to a possible introduction to this talk. A possible introduction would be that we are very interested these days in whether intuition is good or bad. There's a fair amount written about it. We have a lot of, there is a mystique about intuition. The mystique was to some extent promoted, I think, by Malcolm Gladwell's Blink book. I mean, people saw it as an endorsement of the magic of intuition. You have a lot of business leaders and national leaders who claim to hear very clear messages from their gut and to act on those. And so, and by and large, we are inclined to believe them. And we want to believe them. We like this idea that people have access to intuition. Stories about the marvels of intuition abound, like the physician who sees a case and immediately diagnoses whatever it is, the intuition of chess players and so on. And this is all seen as something magical that happens with expertise. There is actually absolutely nothing magical about it. There's nothing magical about the feats of intuition, when they're actually feats of intuition rather than luck, which is the case for many of the people who claim that their gut speaks to them. What happens with expert intuition is that it's produced by reinforced practice. And with a considerable amount of reinforced practice, activities turn and become System 1 activities. In other words, they become automatic and effortless. That happens to us when we drive a car. We have learned to do it. And now, making a left turn into traffic is an exception, but we can do things while we drive a car because driving is mostly automatic. That's a skill. There is no magic. We don't feel that there's something magical about our ability to drive a car and talk at the same time, but it's the same magic that of other feats of intuition. Or, one of my examples is that I can tell my wife's mood from her first word on the telephone. And so can you probably. And that's because we've had a lot of reinforced practice at that kind of detection. Now, in many cases, when people have reinforced practice, they develop true expertise. And that applies to physicians. When they get the practice, when they get the good conditions for learning, and with considerable practice, there is a large difference between different kinds of specialties and professions. So, for example, anesthesiologists are much more likely to develop good intuitions than radiologists, because the feedback conditions are much better for anesthesiologists. They do something, the results are fairly immediate. The radiologists just get very, very poor feedback, if they get any at all. And so they are not in the position of acquiring intuitions. Now, there are people who feel they're expert but are not. And there are quite a few of those. And those people populate Wall Street, for example. So you have a lot of people who really believe they can tell which stocks will go up and which stocks will go down, contrary to the evidence, because most of them believe that others cannot do it, but they can. And that's an important point, by the way, the sense of subjective confidence, which is divorced from any real basis. They just feel that they can do it. And so what we have is some of the intuitions, some of those responses that System 1 provides us with are based on true expertise, because we have learned that, and it has become, recognition has become automatic and effortless. And others, we have the same intuition with the same level of confidence, but it is not based on expertise. How does that work? And I think that the way that it works, I propose that the way that it works, is that associative memory, when it's trying to answer a question, and it cannot answer that question, it will answer another question, and think that it has answered the first one. And the way this happens is in part because any instruction that you get activates, I call that the mental shotgun. You don't actually obey one instruction. You tend to do many things at once when obeying an instruction. I'll give you an example. Suppose I tell you to respond as quickly as possible, by raising your right hand if two words rhyme, and you don't raise your right hand if they don't rhyme, or you raise your left hand. And now I present pairs of words. So vote, note, that rhymes. Vote, goat also rhymes. But vote, goat is considerably slower than vote, note. And the reason is that you visualize. Nobody asked you to visualize. Nobody asked you to compare the spelling. You just do it. It happens. So the instruction to carry out one operation activates other operations. Or, I could give more examples, but we're short of time. What happens then is that if people are asked a difficult question, but there is an answer to an easier question, which is related and comes more easily to mind, people are likely to answer the easier question. And they won't know that they have done it. And that gives rise to many illusions. So I'll give you an example. Here the task, I think, is going to be, the question is, there are going to be several figures. Oh, no, I'll come back to that. Okay. The question is, which of these figures is larger on the screen? And you can't do this. You may know that they're equal. If we took a ruler to them, they are equal. What happens is that our System 1 is really geared to solve problems in 3 dimensions. And so you see the 3-dimensional size. And if this is the picture, then indeed the figure on the right is much larger than the figure on the left. Even when you know it, and you know that this is wrong, you go on seeing it. So this is a case in which quite automatically you answer a question that you haven't been asked. Let me give you another example of here. That's from a survey of students in which the 2 consecutive questions were, how happy are you? And how many dates did you have last month? And when you ask those two questions in this order, the correlation is zero. There is actually, doesn't seem to be the essential thing that determines people's happiness. Now you invert the order and you ask, how many dates did you have last month? How happy are you? Now the correlation is 0.66, which is just about as high as it could get. Clearly what they're doing is they're answering that question. That is, how many dates did you have last month created an emotion? That emotion is more or less happy. Now you ask them, how happy are you? That emotion is on top of the head, and that's what comes out. Now, they're not confused about happiness. They know that happiness is not the same as happiness with their satisfaction with their romantic life. You are not confused about what it means, size on the screen. You can't do it. That is, quite naturally, you get that process of substitution. That process is in some ways marvelous because it means that we're really stumped. That is, and quite often, what is substituted, the answer to the neighboring question, is good enough. And sometimes it isn't. Now, I'll give you another example which brings to bear one of the capabilities of System 1. And this is it. I tell you that Julie is a graduating senior at a college or university, and I'll give you one additional fact about Julie, that she read fluently when she was 4 years old. And I ask you, what is her GPA? And you have an answer. I mean, we all know it's a little more than 3.5, surely, probably less than 4, certainly more than 3.2. There is an answer. What is the answer? This is worth following because that's the capability of System 1, which is quite interesting. There are dimensions of judgment which are intensity dimensions. You can go from more to less, quantitative dimensions. Precocity of reading is one such dimension. And now, I can tell you, here was Julie at age 4, and I could tell you what amount of rain in a day in Seattle corresponds to being able to read fluently at age 4. You'll have an answer. You're able to match the intensity of the precocity variable to the intensity of, the amount of rain on a day, or to actually almost any other quantitative variable. There is an answer, it comes to mind, it gets generated, and now, interestingly enough, the answer that occurred to you when I asked you what is her GPA is in effect a matching of percentiles. You have some idea of how extreme it is in the distribution of reading acquisition, how extreme it is to read fluently at age 4, and you can match that to a GPA that will be roughly equally extreme. If you stop to think about it, this is a truly absurd way of predicting things because it is completely non-regressive. It does not, that information is worth very little. You should make the judgment that is not very different about Julie's GPA from what you would give if you knew nothing at all about her. But in fact, you respond as if this information was sufficient. And this is something else that System 1 does. System 1 is extremely insensitive to the quality and quantity of evidence on which it generates judgments. So I give you that bit of information about Julie, and you can go to town with it. And now if I gave you more information, you would recalibrate, but you would not necessarily make more extreme predictions or make more confident predictions if I gave you more information. This is how the intuitive system works. It generates a story, the best story possible on whatever information is available. And now I get to the point of subjective confidence. Subjective confidence is not a judgment. Subjective confidence is a feeling. And it's a feeling of the quality, of the coherence of the story that you have been able to generate. It's a feeling about the goodness of fit. And when the fit is good, confidence is high. That tells you more about the coherence of the story that System 1 has generated and that the individual is willing to accept than it does of the likelihood that the judgment is in fact correct. Here is another example of substitution. International travelers are asked, how much would you pay for insurance that pays $100,000 in case of death for any reason? People can do that. Then they're asked, how much would you pay for insurance that pays $100,000 in case, how much would you pay for insurance that pays $100,000 in case of death in a terror incident on your next trip? They pay more for the second than they pay for the first. And the reason that they pay more for the second than they pay for the first is that they're more afraid of dying in a terrorism accident than they're afraid of dying. And this is probably true of all of us. What happens is System 1 generates effortlessly, you know what I mean when I say System 1 generate, an emotional reaction is generated. It has a certain intensity. You are asked a question about insurance, and you answer that question about insurance by matching it to the intensity of the emotion that you feel. And there are literally hundreds of examples of this general kind of process. A process of matching. And notice that this really comes to mind fairly quickly, fairly immediately. There is, you don't feel that you're doing anything wrong while you're doing it, because it happens to you. Okay, let me see. I would like to conclude by talking about what I will call illusions of understanding, or illusions that the world is understandable. The ability of System 1, of our intuitive system, to generate coherent stories on the basis of information, of even scant information, unreliable information, means that almost anything that happens, we feel we understand. Our ability to understand things that have happened is extraordinarily good. We can construct stories. Now, this creates an illusion, and the illusion is that the world is knowable, because you understand the world in the past, and it seems that if you understand it in the past, then there must be a structure to it that would enable, all it would take is some intuition, and you'd be able to predict the future. In fact, there may be no structure in the past. It's just a story you're telling yourself. Or it is something that indeed you have learned, but that you didn't know. So, one example is there are two football teams. You think they're equally matched. They play. One of them trashes the other. Now, the one that did the trashing is perceived as much stronger. And you can't remember that you didn't know that ahead of time. That's what's called hindsight. That in hindsight, you misjudged what the probability was, and you misjudged what you yourself used to think about that. What makes this very pernicious, I think, is that it leads us to misunderstand the randomness of the world in a very deep way. And here, my friend Nassim Taleb, a friend and sort of intellectual hero, has had a big influence on my thinking. In his book on Black Swan, he makes very similar points. And the point is, once you tell a story, you're misled by it. And I'll give you an example about the financial crisis. There are people who we believe, and so the story is told, that they knew the crisis was about to happen. This, I think, is a serious cognitive mistake, that we let that statement go by. It's almost a scandal. We should retire the word know from these situations. And the reason is this. When we say that people knew something, we can only apply that verb if what they knew was true. Until we know that it is true, it's not knowledge. In fact, they thought a crisis would happen, and then it happened. They didn't know it. Knowing is really something else. But that's the way we use the word know. That use of the word know gives us the illusion that the world is knowable, even when it is not. In fact, there were equally intelligent and knowledgeable people who knew the same facts and who didn't think there was going to be a crisis. My inference from that is it was not knowable. Some people thought it, and some people thought other things. Very similar about intuition. The mystique of intuition comes in part from the language. We don't say, I had an intuition that this was going to happen, but it was false. Generally, you said, I had an intuition when it came true. That biases us to believe in intuition, and it biases us to believe things about the world that are simply not true. That is what I could do in 30 minutes. Thank you. There's time for questions, I think. So, yes?
Is there a way to train the systems to help us make better decisions?
Is System 1 trainable? I'm very pessimistic. And I'm in part pessimistic about the training of intuition from personal experience, because I've been studying this for 45 years, and my intuitions are just as bad as they ever were. I mean, absolutely nothing has happened to me in terms of making my intuitions more reasonable. It doesn't happen, and that's because System 1, it can be updated very quickly, but it doesn't learn very quickly. You know, a lot of experience typically is needed to acquire skill. So I don't really believe it. I have some vaguely optimistic ideas, but they're only faintly optimistic about what could be done. And this involves getting System 2 involved. So, for example, on that illusion, you are likely to, when you see that picture again, you will still see one thing as the three figures are as different, but you will know that this is a situation in which you cannot trust your vision. That is very useful. And that is something that sometimes people are able to do, usually not about themselves. I mean, what I have learned is I'm really fairly good at detecting the errors of other people. I mean, not my own. And that is generally true, because when I'm making an error, I'm really busy making that error. And I don't, you know, there just isn't enough capacity to get it right. But we are pretty good. That's why I wrote the book, and I had that thing in mind actually from the beginning. I call that educating gossip. Because if you learn a more differentiated language to think about the judgment and thought processes and decision-making of other people, you will improve, and they will learn to anticipate your gossip, and they will improve. So it's a social process. I don't think that people can easily train themselves to have better intuition. Very long answer. Sorry about that. I'll answer the other questions more briefly. Yeah.
You described two systems, but how do we know that there are not three or four, or maybe a continuum of systems?
Oh, I mean, the systems are completely fictitious. They're probably, you know, you could write the whole story very differently. What I mean is, you know, there are two families of processes that share some characteristics, and there probably are blends, and not everything fits very neatly. But clearly there is a whole set of things that happen that the associative system delivers. And then there are things about which we have a sense of authorship and an agency, and they require effort and are susceptible to interference. And as I said immediately, that's what I call the two systems, just because you may have noticed how much easier it is to think about it when you think of it as System 1 does this and System 2 does that. I don't mean to imply that they really exist. Yes?
Is there a lot of variation among people on how much they lean on System 1 versus System 2? And if so, have you looked at the characteristics of those people?
Yes, there are. There are differences in the extent, especially in the extent of self-monitoring. There are significant differences. The people who fail problems like the bat and ball problem are distinctivly different. I mean, for example, they don't delay gratification quite as much. So you give them problems in which they are to imagine that they've ordered something and how much would they pay to get it tomorrow rather than to get it after 3 business days. People who fail the bat and ball problem pay more to get it tomorrow. So there are consistent differences. The correlations, they're not perfect. But yes, there are differences. They're related to intelligence, but it's not quite identical with intelligence. It really is closer to self-control and to the control of attention, which turns out to be central to this whole thing. Yes?
So at the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned about the coherence of things that System 1 generate and that they were reciprocal. So like the smiling makes you happier and being happy makes you smile. So I'm wondering how much is it possible to use System 2 to control System 1 by creating some of those conditions yourself consciously in a way to then generate more System 1 reactions that you can benefit from?
I think that's I think that's an excellent direction to go. That is, and people do know that. That is, people do have an idea of the conditions under which they're likely to be more creative. And they can create those circumstances in which their automatic system will operate differently. I think that's true. It's actually a new thought for me, and I think it's a very good one. Yes.
You were referenced quite a bit in Winifred Gallagher's book on attention called Wrapped. Do you agree with the theory that your life is the sum of what you focus on?
Oh yes. One should never agree to any statement that is made in one sentence. But if you are going to have one sentence about it, it's a good one. I mean, clearly, what we choose to attend to, is determinative of a lot of what happens to us. Certainly of well-being. I've been studying well-being in the last decade, and well-being is very largely about attention. Yes.
As we were listening, I looked around, and most of us are sitting with legs crossed, arms folded, and it's a little foreign to be told kind of how I think and what I'm thinking about. I wonder if our learning style changes or makes any impact or has any correlation to the way in which we make decisions, the way in which we balance System 1 and System 2. So have you noticed a difference in the way in which people learn, or in the way they take in information, and how that changes what they do with it?
That's a very good question, and I don't have an intelligent answer. I don't know. Yes?
So I started a particular technique of meditation 10 years ago, which I observed the vibrations in the body, and those are directly correlated with the emotions. As the emotions change, the observations change. And as long as I'm constantly aware of those vibrations, like the attention there, it's less likely that I'll be carried off by the emotion and make erroneous judgments. So I'm curious, have there been similar experiments done on monks or?
Yeah, there have been.
Repeat the question.
The question was the effects of meditation, the cognitive effects of meditation. There is a fairly large and increasing literature, and clearly there are effects. There is a real problem interpreting that literature, in that the people who study Buddhists, the effects of meditation, are in general meditators, and they find it very difficult to be objective about what they're studying, and so there is a real problem interpreting that literature, and it's turned into a sort of insider's literature for that reason. And I'm not an insider, so I can't tell you very much. Yes?
What's the correlation between System 1 and stereotyping?
System 1 and stereotyping. Stereotyping is the way we think. I mean, we have stereotypes about tables. The stereotype, social stereotypes are very noxious and they cause a great deal of damage. But it is not true that, you can have a mind that is stereotype free. We can't operate that way. So people have stereotypes. And what happens is there is a possibility of controlling your reactions to stereotyping, and in the last few years there is a lot of debate about how early you can make yourself resist a stereotyping impulse. But that the impulse is there and that everybody has it is something that we'd better accept, because otherwise, we won't be very realistic about the way the mind works. So it's not that there are people who are stereotype free. I don't think there are. And if you don't have stereotypes about the people you're not supposed to have stereotypes about, you do have stereotypes about Harvard law professors. So, there are categories that are okay to have stereotypes about. It is true, in general, that overt stereotyping is clearly something that can be controlled. And for people who are there's interesting results on depletion. For people who are very stereotyped, they spend half an hour being polite to somebody of another group that they don't like. And later you give them a hand grip task and they're depleted. They're really tired. Controlling stereotyping is actually very tiring for people when their impulses are strong. Yes? Yes?
So is it possible that system 1 is affected by any social factors, like social norms, or what majority of the people are saying?
Of course. So, the question is, if I understand it, what is the effect of social norms on System 1? Well, System 1 has world knowledge, and world knowledge, to a very large extent, is constructed by social norms. So, of course. Yes?
So, over the last several years, your theories and Dr. Tversky's theories have spun off a kind of a micro-market of popular books. It's an easy question. What among these books are your favorites?
Can you repeat?
Yes. What are my favorite books about, it is true, there is a real industry of books on cognitive limitations and cognitive failures. The best known is clearly Predictably Irrational. I think I like the books by Chip Heath the best on Switch, and here, Switch, and what was the first one? I forget. But those are books that take issues of limitations and apply them to the real world. There are some very good books like that. I'm not a great customer of those because, obviously.
One more question.
Yeah. Yes.
So you mentioned that System 1 could be trained by reinforced learning, reinforced practice. Do you think it's possible to increase System 1's awareness of its own limitations in general by reinforced learning? You don't think so?
I don't think it would be a System 1. System 2 does the monitoring. System 1 is aware of its own fluency, but I don't think that System 1, the way that I describe it, System 1 can be trained, and obviously there are very large and interesting individual differences between people in System 1. What is remarkable is that the whole industry of intelligence testing is, in my terms, about System 2. It's about reasoning. There is something else happening, the kind of coherence of world knowledge that enables us to understand situations, to detect incongruities and so on, for which there are essentially no tests. So we don't know nearly as much about System 1 as we should, and if we define that as a problem, which I think we should do, then probably in a decade we'll know a great deal more. Thank you.